Good morning, church. Good morning. Got a few things I want to share with you before we dive into our sermon this morning. First, I just want to thank Shay. I don't even know if Shay's in this service. I know they were here in the early service. Maybe he's glutton for punishment and came back for a second. I don't know. But Shay did a great job last week, did he not? Did a good job. So when you see him, be sure to thank him for stepping up, and man, we're blessed to have him and his family here, like so many others who are able to step up and do things like that, and so I'm grateful for that. The second thing I want to mention to you, do we have the slide for the Dayton Moore thing? So on February 5th, Sunday, January 5th, we're going to have, did I say February 5th, we're going to have a special guest, Matt Fulks. No, he's not really the special guest. We're going to have Dayton Moore here on February 5th, and it's going to be a really cool time. He and Matt are going to share the stage together and spend some time talking about strength through adversity, how to come out through adversity and come out on the other side stronger. I mean, that's been Dayton's life, right, with his life being in professional sports and just going through the ups and downs of that, and really excited to have him here. If you don't know who Dayton is, Dayton was the general manager of the World Series winning Royals. Right now, he's like special advisor, is that right? Special advisor to the Texas Rangers. But that job doesn't mean he has to move. He's still here in Kansas City, and he's still very much invested in what's happening in Kansas City with seeing the major leagues, his foundation where he works with teenagers doing a lot of like leadership type stuff. We've got some mentors here at this church that work with that. And matter of fact, that day they're going to have some of the C10 kids here with them. There's going to be a table set up in the back. There's a book coming out that I'll let Matt share more about, but a book that's coming out that he and Dayton have been a part of that's kind of highlighting some things that are happening in Kansas City, and our very own Taylor Penrod is highlighted in that book, and so that's really cool, and so we'll have that here to sell if you are interested in that book, but really excited about them coming, and we want to do one service. We wanted everybody to be together so that we can do one service and have them up here on the stage spending time together. So tell your friends, tell your neighbors, your coworkers that Dayton Moore is going to be here on February 5th, and be sure to bring your friends with you. I think it's going to be a really cool time. Matt, did I do an okay job of that? That was horrible? Okay. I'll try better next time. The other thing I want to mention before we jump into the sermon is just remember that tomorrow is a day where our nation slows down and remembers the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., remembers his legacy, honors that legacy. I know there are some days where it feels like we're closer to the dream, and then there are days where it feels like we're just as far away as we were when he first said it. Do you feel that way sometimes? And so there's a quote that I always love from him that says, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." And I think that's a great quote to kind of get us into our sermon this morning, because we're going to start by looking at John 13, verses 34 through 35. Jesus said to them, talking to his disciples, he says, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. And by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So I am, and a lot of you know this already about me, I am a huge fan of the sitcom The Big Bang Theory. Got any Big Bang Theory fans here? I'm a huge fan. I really think that I started watching it in 2007 when it first premiered, and I stayed with it the entire 12 years that it was on the air. And now, my family can vouch for me on this, I watch reruns on TBS all the time. If I'm flipping channels and I can't find something, or I just get tired of flipping through channels, I will land on TBS because there's always reruns of Big Bang Theory on there, and I still laugh out loud at all the same jokes. Matter of fact, not too long ago, I was laughing out loud at some joke that was being made on Big Bang Theory, and Cole gave me this very confused look, and he said, "Haven't you seen this show like 100 times?" And I said, "What's your point?" because I still find it just as funny. One of my very favorite Christmas gifts this year was a book that just came out just a month or two ago called The Big Bang Theory, the definitive inside story of the epic hit series. And I read it while we were on Christmas vacation. I read the entire thing and loved every bit of it. Why am I telling you all this? One, because I have a tendency to overshare. But two, because as I was thinking about the sermon, there's an episode of The Big Bang Theory that popped up in my mind, and I wanted to share it with you. So there's this episode where Sheldon, if you don't know anything about the episode, Sheldon's one of the main characters. He's very quirky. There's this episode where he finds a bird on the outside of his window to his apartment. And Sheldon is very much afraid of birds. He says that he suffers, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, he says he suffers from ornithophobia, which is a great fear of birds. And so most of the episode, he's trying to get rid of this bird. He's trying to get it away from his window. And so he's trying everything. I mean, he's screaming at the window. He's drawing pictures of cats' faces and putting it to his face and then meowing at the window. He's doing everything he can to try to get this bird away from his window, and none of it's working. The bird just is kind of hanging out there. At some point, I don't remember why he does it, but he opens the window, and when he opens the window, that bird just comes flying straight over his head into his apartment. And Sheldon starts freaking out. And not only is he freaking out because the bird is in his apartment, but the bird lands on his spot on the couch. Now, if you know anything about the show, Sheldon has a spot, and nobody sits in a spot. Well, this bird is sitting in his spot on his couch, and that's really making him mad. And so he's all upset that this bird is inside his apartment, the bird's sitting in his couch. Eventually, Amy and Bernadette, who are also characters of the show, they come over. They're trying to kind of calm him down, kind of talk him through this, get him to not be so afraid of this bird, to see that this bird is probably a pet and it's very nice. And so eventually he starts calming down. Eventually he starts warming up to the bird. And then next thing you know, there's this scene where the bird is perched up on his arm, and Sheldon's like looking at him with like these googly eyes, and he's like decided that he's going to name him his little lovey-dovey, so he names him Lovey-Dovey. You're my little lovey-dovey, aren't you? And he just starts talking to him like that. And, you know, the bird kind of cocks his head like you see birds do sometimes. And as the bird's cocking its head back and forth, Sheldon's cocking his head back and forth. And he's just like bonding with this bird. And he's like now found his new best friend. Amy and Bernadette say, you know, we should really make a flyer with the picture of this bird, because I'm sure this is someone's pet in this neighborhood, and I'm sure they're looking for this bird, so we should make a flyer. And Sheldon says, yes, we should make a flyer with a picture of the bird on there, and it should say, is this your bird? Not anymore. And so there's a point later on toward the end of the episode where he takes the bird that's off his arm, it's sitting on the arm of the couch, and Sheldon gets up and he goes over to the window that has been closed, and if I remember correctly, he's looking to see if there's like a nest out there or something that he can get. And so he opens the window, and as soon as he opens that window, that bird flies right over the top of his head and escapes. And Sheldon's just distraught. Sheldon is upset. He's like really sad, and he starts like whispering like, lovey-dovey, come back, lovey-dovey. And he talks about how he had just bought all this bird food on Amazon, and he's like really sad about it. But if you know anything about Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory, you know that his sadness doesn't last very long, that eventually his sadness turns into anger. And so he very quickly changes from sadness to anger, and then all of a sudden he sticks his head out the window and he says, get back here, you stupid bird, so I can love you. And I wonder, have you had those moments where someone is telling you they love you, but the tone of voice or the actions of the moment aren't really matching up with their words? Have you had that experience? They're saying, I love you, but man, it doesn't come across that way, right? It doesn't sound like they love me. It doesn't look like they love me. They say it. The words are coming out of their mouth. It's kind of like, Sheldon, get back here, you stupid bird, so that I can love you. And Jesus in John 13 says, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. I want to stop right there. I give you a new commandment, and I want to go, a new commandment? To love other people's a new commandment? I didn't think that was a new commandment. And the truth is, to love others is not a new commandment. And Jesus knows this. There's a moment in Jesus' life, we know the story well, where the teachers of the law come to him and they say, okay, out of all the laws, which one's the greatest? Out of all the commandments, which one's the greatest? And we know the story. I talk about it a lot. Jesus says, okay, I can't narrow it down to just one. I've got to say two because they're so inseparable that they kind of have to go together. And so he says, here's the greatest command. It's to love God with all your heart and soul and your mind and your strength. And the other one is to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, when Jesus quotes that, he's not quoting a new commandment. He's actually quoting an old commandment. He's quoting Leviticus 19 in verse 18 that says, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You see, to love others is a command that's as old as humanity. It goes all the way back to the very beginning. John, the one who actually recorded the story in John 13, he seems to know this as well, because later on he writes this letter to a church in 2 John, and he says, but now, dear lady, I ask you not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but one that we've heard from the very beginning. Let us love one another. And so John knows this is not a new commandment. There's nothing new about the command to love others. And so if that's true, why does Jesus say, I give you a new commandment that you love one another? What's new about what Jesus says in this text? And I go back and I think back to Sheldon sticking his head out the window, yelling at Lovey-Dovey, saying, get back here, you stupid bird, so I can love you. And I think, a lot of times we want to define love our own way. We want to put our own definitions to love. Or, as I talked about a few weeks ago, we tend to complicate things. We complicate love. We talk it to death. We try to define every little nuance of love and what it looks like and how it acts towards others. I think I even, during the Advent series, I think I made a comment about how, I don't really think that we really need all that many Bible class series on what is love or sermons on what is love. And when I got done with that sermon series, Kurt Williams, right over here, made a beeline for me with a big smile on his face, and he said, you just ruined my midweek men's Bible study because that's what we were going to talk about for the next few weeks. And I was talking in hyperbole a little bit, but I think the point remains, right, that sometimes we can complicate it and we lose sight of how simple the command is to love. And I think when we look back to what Jesus is saying here, and he says, I give you a new commandment, I think what's new about Jesus' command here is not that we love one another, but Jesus ends up putting a definition to love. Jesus ends up putting parameters on this love that had never quite been expressed before. It's not just that we love one another, but rather he qualifies it with these words. Just as I have loved you, you should love others. Just as I have been loving you, the way that I've shown you love, the way that I've expressed my love to you, that's how you should love others. In other words, Jesus says, the way you've seen me do this, this is the way you should do it. Jesus becomes the model for love, and this is what makes this commandment new, is that now Jesus is the focus of it. He's the model of it. John knows this, and so going back to one of his other letters that he wrote in 1 John chapter 2, he says this about love, and it's going to sound like he's kind of talking out of both sides of his mouth, but he says, Beloved, I am writing you no new commandment, but an old commandment that you have heard from the beginning. The old commandment is the word that you have heard. Yet I am writing you a new commandment. You see how he's kind of talking out of both sides of his mouth? Like it's not an old one, it's a new one. No, it's not really a new one, it's an old one that we've always heard. But he says, I am writing you a new commandment that is true in who? In him, in Jesus, he says. And then what he does in that section of 1 John is he goes on and he talks about loving others. And so he says this love that we're talking about, it's a new commandment because it's true in Jesus, because Jesus is the model of the love that we're trying to live out. Jesus is the very definition of that love. It is found in the way that he expressed himself. It's found in the way that he exemplified love. Its newness is found in Jesus and how Jesus defined it. And so the question is, okay, so how does he define it? How does he exemplify the type of love that would make this a new commandment for us? Well, I think it'd be real easy for us on this side of the death, burial, and resurrection to point to the cross and say, well, that's how he defined it. And there's some truth to that, right? That is the fullest expression of that. But guess what? The disciples in John 13 hadn't seen the cross yet. They don't know the cross. They don't know the death, burial, and resurrection. So something that Jesus says here points back to something very specific that they would have been like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. I remember that thing that you did. So what is the thing that Jesus is pointing to when he says to them, just as I have loved you, which points back to something? What is it that he's pointing back to? What is it that he is referring to? Well, we go to John 13. Our passage has been John 13, 34, and 35, but we go back to the very beginning of John 13, a story that we know very well. It says, now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Now the devil had already put into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. During supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given him all things into his hands, and that he had come from God, and that he was going to God, he got up from the table. He took off his outer robe, and he tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin, and he began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you really going to wash my feet? And Jesus answered him, you do not know now what I am doing, but later you'll understand. Peter said, no, you will never wash my feet, Jesus. Jesus answered him, unless I wash you, you have no share with me. And so Simon Peter then said to him, okay, Lord, not just my feet, but wash also my hands and my head. And Jesus said to him, one who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but rather they're entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you, for he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he had said, not all of you are clean. After he had washed their feet, he put on his robe, and he returned to the table, and he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. Just as I have loved you, so you also should love one another. Yes, the cross is the fullest expression of that love, but remember, the disciples at this point know nothing about the cross. So what was their point of reference? It was Jesus taking on the role of a servant and washing their feet. And I think what a beautiful expression of love, that the King of Kings would strip off all of his royalty so that he could become a servant and wash not just his friends' feet, but also wash the feet of the one that he knew was going to betray him. And I think to what Paul said in Philippians, where he says, Jesus emptied himself. He emptied himself of all that made him, right, one with God. He emptied himself of all of that so that he could humble himself and become a servant. Just as I have loved you, points them back to a towel and a basin full of water and a lot of dirty feet. No one else in that room dared to stoop so low. It was beneath all of them. And the one who it should have been the most beneath is the one who stooped that low. Is the one who got down there and did it. And I think, you know what, man, it sounds so simple, but isn't it so hard? It sounds simple, but it seems so hard. The late New Testament scholar D.A. Carson, talking about this passage, he said, "The new commandment is simple enough for a toddler to memorize and appreciate, yet profound enough that the most mature believers are repeatedly embarrassed at how poorly they comprehend it and put it into practice." I'm there. What does it look like? What does this look like? What does this type of love look like? Well, let's be honest. Most of us are not going to be crawling around on our hands and knees washing each other's feet. So if that's not the way we're going to express it, then what does this look like? And again, I don't think we need to complicate it too much. I don't think we need to go into a whole lot of detail. I mean, it seems very simple. What it should look like at its very core is that it should look like service. And we all know what that is, right? We don't have to have a whole long discussion about what service looks like. I mean, we know what that is. And at its very core, that is what it looks like. We should be serving other people. So, I don't know, month and a half ago, somewhere around there, I attended a ribbon-cutting event for this new restaurant that was opening up right next to Grounded Soul, Taylor's coffee shop. Olivia McNabb, so it was me and Taylor and Olivia. Olivia had told me about the restaurant and that it was opening up. I didn't know it was going to be a ribbon-cutting event. I think Taylor and Olivia knew that and didn't tell me. But they had told me about the restaurant and said they were going to go, and they knew that I love Cajun food, and that was something they were serving. And so I was like, yeah, I'm in. I definitely want to go. And so I show up, and like 30 or 40 people are there, and they're all wearing suits and ties and dresses. And I mean, they are dressed up, and I'm in blue jeans and a ratty shirt, and I was not dressed appropriately for it. But anyway, we get there, and we're at this ribbon cutting, and like I said, there's like 30 or 40 people, and they're all standing outside. They got the doors to the restaurant locked because they're waiting to let us all in at the same time. And they got this big ribbon out, and the mayor is there, and he gives a speech, and they have like this prominent pastor from the area that was there, and he's like praying blessings over everyone, and they give like the big cardboard check as like a donation of money, and they have the big scissors and cut the ribbon, and they do all this stuff. And so it's a whole big event. We're all standing outside being a part of it, which was really cool. And after they had gone through all the speeches and the prayers and the ribbon cutting and getting pictures of everybody and doing all that stuff, they finally opened the doors to let us in. And there was this one gentleman that I watched who went to open the door and hold it open for one elderly lady that was trying to get into the building. But you know what happens to the one person who walks up and holds the door open for one person to walk through when there's a crowd of them behind it. He got stuck holding that door open for every single person to walk into that restaurant. And so as we're walking in, I'm making eye contact with him, and I'm smiling a little bit, and I said, you know, it's always that first nice guy that gets stuck holding the door open for everybody else. And he said, nice guy or sucker. But I was thinking about that, and it made me think about something I heard a preacher when I was growing up, something that he said a long time ago. And I know he was talking about love. I don't remember if he was talking about this passage, but he was talking about love, and he said, you know, if we all in church, if we all really lived out this kind of love, no one would ever make it inside the church building on a Sunday morning because everyone would be stuck outside holding the door open saying, no, after you. No, I insist. After, I'm not going in until you go in. And he said all of us would be stuck outside waiting for someone to walk through the door because we all want to serve the other one if we truly lived out this love that Jesus calls us to. And again, I think, man, that seems so simple. But isn't that the love he calls us to? Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Love is not emotional bash. It is not empty sentimentalism, but rather it is the active outpouring of one's whole being into the being of another." And then later on, he simplified that by saying this: life's most persistent and urgent question is this: what are you doing for someone else? He said life's number one question, life's most persistent and urgent question that we should be asking ourselves every day: what are you doing for someone else? What are you doing for someone else? Jesus tells his disciples then, and he still is telling us this today, he says, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. And by this," and I want you to hear this, church, because I grew up in a time where we thought that the only way anybody would know if we were true followers of Jesus is if we worshiped a certain way and got church right. But that's not what Jesus says. Jesus says, by this, loving others the way that I have loved you, by this, all the world will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. This is the word of the Lord for us today. Let's stand and let's sing.